Imagine standing on a sidewalk, and you're watching someone take millions of dollars in crisp $100 bills, and they just pile them up in the gutter.
Right.
And then they just casually set the whole pile on fire.
That would be, I mean, physically painful to watch.
Exactly. Think about that absolute visceral horror you'd feel watching that kind of waste, that feeling in your gut, that instinct that something incredibly valuable is being just, tragically destroyed.
Yeah.
Well, that is exactly how a 19th century American pioneer felt when they looked at a beautiful, wild, free-flowing river.
Which is so hard for us to grasp today.
It really is. Because, we usually look at massive infrastructure like a suspension bridge or a multi-lane highway, and we just see functional concrete and steel.
Right. It's just a tool. You need to cross a gap, so you build a bridge. It's visible, it's exact, and it's entirely utilitarian.
But when you look at the staggering walls of concrete blocking up the rushing rivers of the American West, that whole objective engineering framework just kind of falls apart.
It really does.
We aren't just looking at public works. We are looking at a fossilized belief system.
Which is, frankly, what makes those structures infinitely more fascinating than just like a simple highway.
Totally.
Because when you stand at the base of one of those western dams and you're looking up at hundreds of feet of curved concrete holding back this massive man-made inland sea.
It's terrifying, honestly.
It is. But you are literally looking at a 19th century worldview frozen in time. The terrain didn't just dictate the engineering, a deeply held philosophy dictated the engineering.
And uncovering that philosophy is basically our mission for this deep dive today.
I'm very excited for this one.
Me too.
Yeah.
We are opening up a historical dossier today titled The Doctrine of Domination. It's this incredibly detailed exploration of the intellectual history behind, why the rivers of the American West were dammed in the first place.
And it is a dense, dense history.
Yeah, it is. But to really grasp the material in front of us, we have to establish a very specific mindset right off the bat.
Good.
We are going to reconstruct a worldview from the 19th and early 20th centuries that most of us listening today, probably no longer share at all.
Right. It's a completely foreign mindset to a modern listener.
Exactly. Our goal here is to genuinely understand why incredibly intelligent, hardworking, well-meaning people could stand on the banks of a wild river and see absolutely nothing but wasted water.
And setting the tone right here at the start is absolutely crucial for you, the listener, to get the most out of this deep dive.
Definitely.
Because we are stepping back in time. And to do that effectively, we have to practice radical intellectual empathy.
Radical intellectual empathy. I like that phrasing.
Well, it's necessary.
Oh.
We cannot judge the past by, the environmental standards or the ecological awareness of the modern era. It just doesn't work.
Right. We have to step inside their boots.
Exactly. We have to step inside the boots of people who viewed harnessing nature not as an act of destruction, but as progress, as patriotism.
Wow, patriotism.
Yeah, and even as a profound moral duty. To them, pouring millions of tons of concrete into a riverbed wasn't some evil conquest of nature. It was the perfection of it.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to truly understand how someone looks at a river and sees an unfinished project, we have to start with the physical reality they were facing.
The geography.
Right, the geography of ambition,
Yeah.
and the brutal, just unyielding reality of the American West. I was looking at the maps in the dossier, and there's this invisible wall right down the middle of the North American continent.
The 100th meridian?
Yes, everything to the east of it is green, and everything to the west is brown. How did settlers coming from wet places even process that massive physical shift?
Well, that invisible wall is basically the key to the entire story. To understand the dams, you really have to understand the map.
Okay, take us back.
So between 1803 and 1848, the United States acquired an enormous amount of territory, like staggering amounts.
Right, starting with the Louisiana Purchase.
Exactly. The Louisiana Purchase from France basically doubled the size of the country overnight. And then we push all the way through the Mexican Cession in 1848.
Which is a huge chunk of land.
Huge. The U.S. acquired what is now California, Nevada, Utah, and parts of Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Wyoming.
So the young nation suddenly possesses this vast, sweeping empire.
Right. But there was a geographical catch that they were entirely unprepared for.
And that's that invisible wall we were just talking about, the 100th meridian.
Exactly. That line of longitude, literally changes the destiny of the continent. It runs straight down through the Dakotas, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas.
Okay, so split right down the middle.
Right. And east of that line, the United States is a humid, rain-fed country. It's the environment that European settlers and, their ancestors for generations before them actually knew how to farm.
Because the rules are pretty simple there, right?
Very simple. You clear the trees, you plant the seeds, and the rain falls reliably from the sky to water your crops. It is a predictable, dependable cycle.
But the moment you cross west over that line...
The reliable rainfall simply stops. The air physically changes in your lungs.
Wow.
The soil turns alkaline and dusty. The tall grass gives way to shortgrass prairie, and eventually just sagebrush and desert. You enter an empire of absolute aridity.
Which means they weren't just packing up their wagons to move, they were packing up an agricultural playbook that was about to violently collide with reality.
Oh, total collision.
And they were carrying incredibly heavy intellectual baggage with them, too. They brought Manifest Destiny, which was this intense mid-19th century religious and political conviction that American expansion across the continent wasn't just like a good idea, it was providentially ordained.
It was a divine mandate from God.
Right, a mandate to settle the land, tame the wilderness, and build a transcontinental republic.
And layered right on top of that religious fervor was an older, very powerful Enlightenment philosophy.
From folks like John Locke, right?
Exactly. Think of the ideas floating around since Locke. There was this pervasive belief that nature in its raw or wild state was essentially incomplete, almost worthless.
Wait, really? Worthless?
Yeah, according to this philosophy, land only found its true purpose, its perfection, when human labor was applied to it.
So if you aren't working it, it's failing.
Right. A wild, unmanaged forest was just waiting to be harvested into lumber. A rolling prairie was just waiting to be plowed into a productive wheat field.
Okay, I see where this is going.
And a wild river, crashing over rocks and flowing out to the ocean, was nature in its most unfinished, chaotic state.
So you combine those two incredibly potent ideas. You have divine mandate to spread across the continent, and you had this philosophical belief that raw nature is a failure until human hands improve it.
It's a powerful mix.
Now put yourself in the shoes of a pioneer. Imagine you are a settler who has dragged your family in a wooden wagon thousands of miles across the plains.
Dealing with disease, broken wheels, total exhaustion.
Exactly, all to build a new life. And you arrive in a place like Wyoming or Nevada, and you claim your land under the Homestead Act of 1862.
Well, and the Homestead Act is a perfect example of Eastern legislation completely failing in Western geography.
How so?
Well, Congress wrote a law saying any adult citizen could claim 160 acres of surveyed government land.
Which sounds great on paper.
Sure, because that 160-acre template was designed perfectly for the well-watered East. If you have 160 acres in Ohio, the rain falls, your crops grow, and you become a prosperous, independent farmer.
It's enough land to feed your family and, generate a modest surplus.
Right. But in the arid West, 160 acres without reliable rainfall isn't a farm.
What is it?
It's just a patch of dirt where you are going to slowly starve to death.
Let's visualize that reality for a second. You are that homesteader. You're out there in the blistering heat. The wind is howling. The dust is just blowing into your eyes and your mouth.
Brutal conditions.
And you've planted your seeds, but the sky is completely clear week after week. Your crops are withering into brittle stalks.
The drought is literally bankrupting your family.
Right. And right next to your dying, parched farm is a river, pouring millions of gallons of fresh, cold, life-saving water straight past you, running completely unused all the way down to the ocean.
It would drive a person absolutely mad.
It goes right back to that burning money analogy from the beginning. Watching that water flow past your starving family was agonizing.
You wouldn't look at that water and say, the beautiful natural ecology of the river system, we must leave it undisturbed for the trout.
No, absolutely not. You would say this is a profound tragedy. This is a moral failure to let this life-giving resource go to waste when it could save my children.
Exactly. To that settler, leaving the water in the river wasn't pure or natural. It was a tragic, sinful waste of potential food, potential life, and potential civilization.
So if we connect this to the bigger picture, you can begin to see how Manifest Destiny, when applied to water, completely flipped the script on how we view nature.
An unharnessed river wasn't a pristine ecosystem to be admired. It was a loud, roaring symbol of a nation failing its providential duty.
Wow. Failing its duty.
Yeah. For that settler, Digging a ditch by hand, dragging rocks with a team of horses to build a makeshift barrier, and diverting that water onto the dry, fertile soil to grow food, that wasn't an act of greed.
Or environmental destruction.
Right. It was the ultimate virtue. It was an act of creation, literally bringing life from the dust.
So judged by the values of that generation, settlement, productivity, self-reliance, and survival, putting the river to work was an absolute moral imperative.
Precisely.
I really want you, the listener, to feel that desperation and that hope because it frames everything that happens next in this deep dive.
It's the emotional core of the era.
Because, of course, digging as small ditches by hand or with a few horses was incredibly difficult, and those primitive dirt dams washed out every time the spring floods came.
Nature was a lot stronger than a dirt ditch.
Right. And when human ambition hits a geographic wall that massive, people don't just, pack up and admit defeat right away.
No, they don't. First, they try to negotiate with reality. They hope that nature will just magically adapt to their needs.
Because human psychology is incredibly resilient, right?
Resilient, yes. And it can be deeply delusional when survival is on the line.
Okay, how so?
Well, before Americans turned to massive federally funded engineering to fix the aridity problem, they went through this bizarre phase where they believed they wouldn't have to build massive dams at all.
Wait, really? What did they think would happen?
In the 1870s, a theory began to sweep across the plains and the western settlements. And it was known by this very catchy, deeply reassuring phrase, rain follows the plow.
Rain follows the plow. I mean, it sounds like a proverb or almost like a magical incantation.
It basically was. The theory was popularized by a man named Charles Dana Wilbur. He was a town builder and an amateur scientist, and he was drawing on some earlier survey work by a guy named Cyrus Thomas in 1871.
Okay, so what was the actual theory?
The theory argued that the very act of human settlement would permanently alter the climate of the West.
That is bold.
They had a whole mechanical explanation for it, too. The idea was that the hard, baked crust of the desert soil was reflecting heat and preventing moisture absorption.
Okay, tracking so far.
Right, so by bringing in steel plows, breaking the soil, planting crops, and planting trees, settlers would allow the earth to absorb the scant rain that did fall.
And then what?
That moisture would then be released slowly into the atmosphere through evaporation and plant transpiration, which would create clouds and thereby permanently increase the rainfall.
Let me make sure I'm wrapping my head around this. They literally believe that if you just settled the desert and scratched the dirt, the desert would change its own meteorological laws and decide to water itself as a reward for your hard work.
That is exactly the mechanism they pitched.
It's a closed-loop system of pure hope.
It is. But it gave this massive, chaotic, often deeply tragic westward rush a comforting veneer of science.
Because it sounded official.
Right. It told the settlers exactly what they desperately wanted to hear, that their presence in the desert was not only divinely ordained, but physically transformative.
Like the climate itself was bowing to American industry.
Exactly. It was the deeply optimistic, almost utopian phase of the pioneer dream.
But there's a tragic part to this, isn't there?
There is. The tragic part is that sheer desperation, combined with a few coincidentally wet years in the 1870s and 1880s, created this illusion that the theory was actually working.
Oh, no. So they actually got some rain.
They did. The climate really did seem to be changing, and this coincidence encouraged the massive they did. But the alternative was admitting that the grand national project of settling the continent had hit a physical limit that they could not overcome.
And people hate hitting limits.
Admitting defeat, especially for an expanding empire fueled by a belief in its own exceptionalism, is incredibly difficult. When the data contradicts your deepest cultural beliefs, you usually find a way to rewrite the data.
It reminds me so much of modern tech utopian thinking.
Oh, that's an interesting comparison.
The psychological mechanism feels identical. I mean, you see this all the time today where we face these incredibly deep, systemic, structural, societal issues like extreme poverty or the climate crisis or massive educational inequality. And people will confidently argue that a new app or a new artificial intelligence algorithm will just magically solve it all.
Right, without any structural change.
Exactly. We assume that our latest technological endeavor will effortlessly iron out all the fundamental realities without us having to make any difficult sacrifices or change our behavior. We literally convince ourselves that our hard work and ingenuity can rewrite the laws of reality.
That is a brilliant parallel.
Rain follows the plow was just the 19th century version of, there's an app for that.
It really was. It is the core belief that our sheer ingenuity and our good intentions will force reality to bend to our will.
But reality doesn't usually bend, does it?
No. As always happens with magical thinking, reality eventually reasserts its own rules.
Hmm.
In the 1890s, the temporary wet period ended, and brutal, unyielding droughts swept across the Great Plains and the American West.
Just a complete drying out.
The skies dried up for years,
Huh.
the crops turned to dust and literally blew away in the wind. The pseudoscientific theory was shattered against the hard ground.
That must have been devastating.
Countless families were completely ruined, their life savings were gone, their livestock was dead, and they were driven all the way back east in total defeat.
Wow.
They even had slogans painted on their wagons like, "In God we trusted, in Kansas we busted."
That is a completely devastating continent-wide reality check.
It was a generational trauma. But this is the crucial pivot in our story today.
Okay, what happened?
When the droughts of the 1890s kill the theory of rain follows the plow, the underlying dream of a watered, blooming West did not die. The ambition survived the tragedy.
Wait, really? After all that suffering?
Yes, the lesson that Americans drew from the failure wasn't, oh, I guess the West is just too dry to settle at scale. Let's adapt to the landscape and go home.
So they didn't pack up the ideology, they just changed their tool.
Exactly. The lesson they drew is much more aggressive. They said, nature is not going to water the desert for us voluntarily. Therefore, we are going to force it to.
Ah, I see.
The dream of the blooming desert simply took off its pioneer hat and put on an engineer's hard hat. If the climate wouldn't change, they would physically change the plumbing of the entire North American continent.
And what's wild when you read through the dossier is that they didn't have to learn this lesson the hard way. The tragedy of the 1890s wasn't completely unavoidable.
No, it wasn't.
Because not everyone was blinded by this relentless optimism. There was actually a very loud, very official warning, and it is fully documented in the historical record decades before the droughts even hit.
Yes, running completely counter to the magical thinking of the boosters and the politicians is the dissonant conscience of this entire era, a man named John Wesley Powell.
Powell is such a fascinating, almost mythical figure. I mean, he feels like a character out of a novel.
Powell's biography is staggering. He was a self-taught explorer, a brilliant geologist, and a hardened Civil War veteran.
Right, he fought at Shiloh?
He did, and he actually lost most of his right arm to a mini ball at the Battle of Shiloh. But after the war, he didn't retire to a desk. He became famous for leading the first documented expedition down the Green and Colorado rivers in 1869.
Which, just think about the physical reality of that expedition.
It's hard to fathom.
Powell and his crew took heavy wooden rowboats and navigated them blindly through the depths of the Grand Canyon.
Right, with no communication.
None. They were running Class 5 rapids, crashing over boulders, losing their food rations to the river, entirely cut off from the outside world for months.
And remember, Powell had one arm.
Exactly. Powell literally navigated the most treacherous wild waters in the West with one arm, strapping himself to a chair mounted on the deck of his boat just to see the rapids ahead.
The man knew the Western landscape intimately. He wasn't a politician sitting in a comfortable armchair in Washington spinning theories about climate change.
He was the guy doing the brutal math in the dirt.
Yes, he had touched the rocks, measured the velocity of the rivers, and felt the absolute bone-dry aridity of the desert firsthand.
So what did he do with all that hard-won knowledge?
Later on, Powell became the director of the U.S. Geological Survey. And in 1878, which is a full generation before the era of massive federal dam building began, Powell handed the Secretary of the Interior a meticulously researched document.
What was it called?
It was called The Report on the Lands of the Arid Region of the United States. And the message in that report was the exact opposite of everything the nation, the railroads, and the politicians wanted to hear.
He brought the cold, hard data to the party, and it completely ruined the vibe.
He really did. Powell warned, explicitly and with mathematical proof, that the West is fundamentally immutably dry.
Immutably dry, no changing it.
Right. He calculated the volume of water in the western rivers and compared it to the vast acreage of the western landmass.
Right.
And he proved that only a tiny fraction of the land, he suggested well under 10%, could ever realistically be irrigated.
Under 10%. That is a tiny fraction of what everyone was hoping for.
There simply was not enough surface water in existence to cover the land, no matter how hard they worked or how many ditches they dug.
And he didn't just point out the problem, he actually proposed a completely different, highly logical way of living out there.
He did. He told Congress that the land laws written for the humid East, like the 160-acre Homestead Act with its neat, square grid lines, were absolutely useless and actually dangerous in the West.
So, What was his alternative?
He made a radical proposal for restructuring Western society. He said, instead of carving the land up into arbitrary square grids that ignore the terrain, we need to organize the West by watersheds.
Wait, let's explain the mechanics of that. What does organizing society by a watershed actually look like?
Well, a watershed is simply an area of land that drains all its rainfall and streams into a common outlet, like a large river or a lake.
Okay.
Powell argued that political and property boundaries should follow the natural topography of the land, tracing the high ridges that separate one river basin from another.
So the landscape dictates the lines.
Yes, communities should be formed communally around shared water access, not arbitrary surveyor lines drawn on a map in Washington. Because if you control a square of land that happens to have river on it, and your neighbor has a square with no river, your neighbor will eventually die or kill you for the water.
Wow. Yeah, that makes sense.
Powell wanted cooperative irrigation districts based on natural boundaries.
Which makes perfect, undeniable sense if you are actually looking at the physical reality of the land.
It was brilliantly rational. And Congress, influenced by railroad barons and land speculators who wanted to sell the West as an easily divided commodity, completely ignored him.
Just totally swept it under the rug.
Completely.
It's like an accountant walking into a booming, high-flying tech startup. The accountant lays out the spreadsheets, walks the founders through the math, and proves that they have absolutely zero financial runway left and are about to hit a wall.
Great analogy.
And the founders just look at the numbers, laugh, and fire the accountant because the vibes are too good and the venture capital is still flowing. They were running on pure ideological momentum, and Powell was trying to tell them they were running toward a cliff.
This raises an important question, and it is basically the central unresolved tension of our entire deep dive today. We have to reckon with this.
Okay, let's hear it.
Powell's warning was not a secret. It wasn't hidden in a drawer. It was a published, public, federal record. Decades before the great concrete dams were poured, the information was there.
Right in front of them.
So when the nation proceeded to dam the rivers and build an unsustainable empire of water anyway, why did they do it?
That is the million-dollar question.
Was it good faith ignorance? Did the politicians and the early engineers genuinely just misunderstand the scale of the environment, despite Powell's warnings, believing that their new technology could somehow stretch the water further than Powell thought possible? Was it willful indifference? Did they hear the warning clearly, but choose to look away because the dream of a conquered continent was just too psychologically powerful to abandon?
Or was it just greed?
Right. Was there simply too much money and political power to be gained by land speculators, railroad monopolies, and boosters, making Powell's truth just too inconvenient to tolerate?
I think it's crucial for you listening to this to know that we are not going to definitively answer that question right now.
No, we can't.
We are planting that seed. The reality is that it was likely a complex, shifting mix of ignorance, indifference, and greed in different decades, different states, and different individuals. But the overarching point is that the tragedy of Western water wasn't a surprise attack by nature.
No, the warning was given.
The warning was given, the warning was ignored. The devastating droughts of the 1890s forced a brutal reckoning. And out of that wreckage, the solution that emerged wasn't to retreat and listen to Powell.
Not at all. The solution became massive federal intervention. The era of magical thinking died in the dust, and the era of colossal bureaucracy was born.
Because the droughts proved that private capital and individual farmers couldn't build dams big enough to survive the dry years. They needed a bailout, and they needed deep pockets.
And those pockets only existed in one place.
So we move from the pioneer's desperate dream into the halls of power in Washington, D.C. Let's look at the year 1902.
1902 is the watershed year for the American West.
No pun intended.
Right. On June 17th, 1902, President Theodore Roosevelt, who had spent time in the West and fancied himself a conservationist and a champion of the strenuous life, signed the Reclamation Act.
Also known as the Newlands Act.
Yes, often called the Newlands Act after its primary author, a Nevada congressman named Francis G. Newlands. This law did something entirely unprecedented in American history.
What did it do?
It committed the federal government as a permanent standing institution to financing and building massive irrigation works dams, canals, reservoirs across the arid West.
It took the staggering financial burden off the backs of the individual struggling settlers and put the unlimited weight of the United States Treasury behind the taming of the rivers.
The financial mechanism they designed to fund this was actually quite elegant on paper.
How did it work?
They created something called the revolving fund. Here's the mechanism. The federal government would sell public lands in 16 western states to settlers and timber companies.
Okay, land sales.
The proceeds from those massive land sales would flow into a special, dedicated federal fund. That fund would then be used to pay engineers to design and build a massive federal irrigation project, a dam and a canal system.
So they build the infrastructure.
Right. And once the dam was built, the newly watered, fertile land downstream would be sold to farmers.
So far, so good.
The farmers would then pay back the cost of the water delivery infrastructure over a period of 10 years. And those repayment installments would go right back into the revolving fund, which would then be used to build the next dam and water the next valley and so on.
It was conceived as a financial perpetual motion machine of desert conquest.
It was. But friction always breaks perpetual motion machines.
Yeah, what was the friction here?
The friction here was that the desert was still too dry, the farming was too hard, and the farmers almost immediately started defaulting on their payments because they couldn't squeeze enough profit out of the alkaline soil.
So the money didn't revolve.
No, but the bureaucracy didn't care. The machine had already been turned on. And to execute this massive vision, they needed an army of experts.
Enter the Bureau of Reclamation.
Yes. Within weeks of the law passing in July 1902, the Secretary of the Interior created the U.S. Reclamation Service. It was initially housed within Powell's old agency, the Geological Survey, but it soon broke off and became its own immensely powerful entity, eventually renamed the Bureau of Reclamation.
And their first director was Frederick Newell.
Right, a hydrographer. Suddenly, an idea that had mostly lived in the desperate hopes of pioneers and the exaggerated, colorful pamphlets of town boosters had a massive federal budget, a highly trained staff of civil engineers, and a legal mandate to remake the plumbing of the continent.
We really need to pause here and look closely at the language they use because words matter so much here. They didn't call it the Bureau of Dam Building or the Bureau of River Management. They called it reclamation.
Which is such a loaded term.
Think about the sheer audacity of that word. You can't reclaim something unless you believe it rightfully belonged to you in the first place.
The linguistics here reveal the entire underlying philosophy. If you deconstruct the verb to reclaim a piece of land implies that it was lost, degraded, or perhaps held in default, and now you are taking it back and restoring it to its rightful state.
Right. Think about reclaiming a stolen piece of art or reclaiming a swamp by draining it.
Exactly. When the politicians and engineers spoke of reclaiming the desert, the language itself framed nature as a debtor. It implied that the arid West, in its natural, dry, wild state, was somehow broken or in a state of failure.
So the river running wild to the sea was a chaotic mistake.
And human engineering irrigation was the necessary correction to bring the earth back to its intended fruitful condition. The word reclamation encoded the entire Enlightenment ideology into federal law. Nature unimproved is nature unfinished.
It's a staggering amount of cultural arrogance baked into a single bureaucratic title. It assumes that human utility is the only valid metric for the Earth's existence.
It really does.
But the Bureau of Reclamation wasn't the only game in town, were they? They had a sister agency or maybe a rival agency out there pouring their own millions of tons of concrete.
Yes, they did. The Bureau of Reclamation became one of the two great dam-building titans of the American West. But the older of the two was actually the military, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers.
The Army Corps?
Their Civil Works mission dated all the way back to 1824.
Oh, wow, that early.
Yeah, Congress originally directed the Army Corps to start clearing dangerous snags, fallen trees, and sandbars out of the Ohio and Mississippi rivers to make them safe for the booming steamboat navigation industry.
So the Army Corps had a massive head start on re-engineering rivers.
A nearly 80-year head start. And over the ensuing century, that original modest charge to clear rivers grew into a colossal federal mandate. The Army Corps became the nation's premier builder of navigation channels, dredging rivers deep enough for massive barges.
And eventually flood control.
Exactly. They became the ultimate federal authority on flood control, building levees and dams to stop rivers from destroying the cities built on their floodplains.
What's fascinating to me is how these two massive, well-funded bureaucracies approached the exact same rivers with completely different justifications, but ended up doing the exact same physical thing.
It is a profound historical irony.
Break that down for us.
Well, the Bureau of Reclamation's watchword was irrigation. Their explicit mission was to make the desert bloom, When a reclamation engineer looked at a river, they saw potential agriculture, they saw fields of alfalfa and orchards.
Right. And the Army Corps.
The Army Corps of Engineers' watchwords were navigation and flood control. Their mission was to make the river safe and useful for commerce and to stop it from rising up and drowning the towns. When an Army Corps engineer looked at a river, they saw a volatile transportation corridor that needed to be stabilized and tamed.
Irrigation. Navigation, flood control. I mean, if you survey a population today, everyone agrees those sound incredibly respectable.
They sound like the essential foundational building blocks of a safe, civilized society.
They are deeply humane-sounding purposes. You are growing food, facilitating trade, and saving lives from floods.
But in practice, out there in the physical world, every single one of those noble goals required the exact same physical solution: putting a massive, immovable concrete wall across a moving river.
Whether you wanted to divert the water into a canal for a farm, deepen the river channel upstream for a barge, or hold back the violent spring runoff in a reservoir to protect a city, the result was a dam.
To both agencies, despite their different charters and rivalries, a free-flowing, unimpeded river was a river that was slacking off. It was a river not yet doing its job.
So what does this all mean? It means that by the early 20th century, the abstract, desperate dream of a lone pioneer watching his crops die had metamorphosed.
It grew up.
Yeah, the desperation had grown up into a well-funded, legally mandated, unstoppable government machine with dual engines reclamation and the Army Corps grinding away at the Western landscape.
But bureaucracy and federal funding alone do not fully explain the sheer unyielding fervor of the era.
There was more to it.
Oh, yes. It wasn't just money and concrete building these dams. It was a brand new intellectual era that worshipped at the altar of science, data, and efficiency. To understand the scale of what happened next, we have to introduce the intellectual keystone of this entire mindset.
The progressive era.
The progressive era. This is the turn of the 20th century, roughly the 1890s to the 1920s.
It was a time when reformers across all of American life looked at the chaos, the inequality, and the sprawling corruption of the Gilded Age, and decided that society's problems could be cured by applying rigorous scientific principles and expert management to everything.
Exactly. The progressive gospel placed an almost religious faith in scientific management, in maximum efficiency, and in the oversight of society by highly trained, specialized, university-educated experts.
They believed that politics and emotion were messy, but data and engineering were pure.
And when they took that intense faith in efficiency and applied it to the natural world, it produced a powerful philosophy known as utilitarian conservation.
And the high priest, the absolute most influential voice of utilitarian conservation, was a man named Gifford Pinchot.
Gifford Pinchot is a towering figure in American environmental history. He was the first chief of the U.S. Forest Service, appointed in 1905 under Teddy Roosevelt.
So he wasn't a dam builder himself.
No, Pinchot was not a dam builder. He is a forester who studied in Europe. But he was the clearest, most aggressive voice of the progressive era conviction that nature exists strictly to be used by humanity, but to be used wisely and scientifically.
Because up until then, the standard American business practice was incredibly destructive. Lumber companies would just go in, clear-cut an entire mountain of ancient timber, take the profits, leave a ruined wasteland that would inevitably catch fire, and move on to the next mountain.
Pinchot looked at that and said, no, that's not just ugly, that's deeply inefficient. That is a waste of a long-term asset.
And he had a very specific metric he used, right?
Yes. Pinchot introduced a famous metric, a guiding principle that he borrowed from utilitarian philosophy and refined into his own famous phrasing. He argued that all natural resources should be scientifically managed by experts to provide, and this is the defining quote of his career, the greatest good of the greatest number in the long run.
The greatest good of the greatest number in the long run. I mean, it sounds incredibly democratic, fair, and logical.
It is a highly seductive philosophy, but we have to look closely at what that meant in practice, out in the woods and on the rivers. Crucially, Pinchot's philosophy was conservation, not preservation.
Wait, what's the difference?
Well, Pinchot did not want nature left alone to exist for its own sake. To him, locking away a beautiful forest just to look at it, or leaving a river wild just to hear it run, was almost as much of a sin as clear-cutting it.
Because you weren't using it.
Exactly. Because in both cases, society wasn't getting a sustainable, measurable yield. He wanted nature used scientifically, harvested sustainably for the broad public economic benefit.
So a forest existed to yield a mathematically calculated amount of timber forever.
And a river existed to yield a mathematically calculated amount of water and hydroelectric power forever.
It's the ultimate application of Taylorism applied to the wild. Let's break that down. Frederick Winslow Taylor was a mechanical engineer who invented scientific management for factories.
Right, the stopwatch guy.
He would literally stand over factory workers with a stopwatch, timing every single motion of their hands, trying to shave off seconds to make the assembly line perfectly efficient. Pinchot and the dam builders took that exact same stopwatch mentality and applied it to the living natural world.
It's a perfect comparison.
They took a chaotic, complex, living river ecosystem and mentally transformed it into standardized, manageable, extractable resource units. A river wasn't a living thing. It was just a delivery mechanism for acre-feet of water and kilowatts of power.
And we should visualize what an acre-foot actually is, because
Sure.
that is the unit they use to slice up the rivers.
Right, wait, let's explain that mechanically. An acre-foot isn't just a number on a ledger. It's a volume of water.
Right.
Picture an entire American football field, end zone to end zone. Now imagine flooding that entire field with water to a depth of exactly 1 foot. That is 1 acre-foot, roughly 326,000 gallons.
It's a lot of water.
When the progressive engineers looked at a rushing river, they weren't seeing water over rocks. They were mentally slicing that moving water into thousands of football field-sized blocks of utility. And if you didn't extract those blocks and put them to work, you were committing the greatest sin of the progressive era. You were being inefficient.
To leave a river idle was the real waste.
But this view had pushback, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. This utilitarian view of wise use immediately clashed with a totally different, much older way of seeing nature. Pinchot's great rival in the public sphere was John Muir.
John Muir, the famous Scottish-born naturalist, writer, and founder of the Sierra Club.
Yes, Muir represented the ideal of preservation. He was the guy out sleeping under the stars, climbing trees during thunderstorms just to feel the wind.
Muir believed that certain places in nature had intrinsic, spiritual, and aesthetic worth that was entirely separate from their economic utility.
He believed wild places should be preserved exactly as they were, simply because they existed, and because human beings needed wildness for their souls, not just raw materials for their sawmills.
To Muir, a river was a temple. To Pinchot, it was a resource.
And these two titans, Pinchot and Muir, these two fundamentally opposed worldviews, collided head-on in what is probably the most revealing and dramatic environmental battle of the early 20th century, the fight over Hetch Hetchy.
A Hetch Hetchy controversy, which raged in Congress and in the newspapers roughly from 1908 to 1913. It is the perfect, tragic illustration of which ideology ultimately won the American soul.
Let's set the scene for that. Hetch Hetchy was a stunning glacier-carved valley in the Sierra Nevada mountains. John Muir, who knew the mountains better than anyone, considered it a twin to the famous Yosemite Valley. Just as beautiful, just as sacred.
And importantly, Hetch Hetchy was located directly inside the legal boundaries of Yosemite National Park.
Yes, it was inside the park.
Which, to a modern mind, means it is totally untouchable. It's a national park. You can't build there.
You would certainly think so. But the rapidly growing city of San Francisco, which was desperately reeling after the catastrophic 1906 earthquake and the fires that followed, needed a massive, reliable, publicly owned water supply.
So they look to the mountains.
The city engineers looked up at the mountains, ran the topographical math, and decided that the most efficient, logical, gravity-fed place to build a massive reservoir was right in the middle of Hetch Hetchy Valley.
Inside the park.
They petitioned the federal government for the right to build a massive concrete dam inside a protected national park.
It is almost unimaginable today that a city would just casually propose flooding a valley in Yosemite.
It sparked a brutal, deeply emotional national debate. John Muir and his allies fought furiously, mounting a massive public relations campaign.
What was their argument?
Muir argued passionately that flooding a temple of nature like Hetch Hetchy was a literal desecration, a sin against God's creation.
And Pinchot?
Giver Pinchot and the utilitarian conservationists argued right back with cold, hard utilitarian logic. Pinchot testified before Congress that providing a secure, clean water supply for hundreds of thousands of tax-paying citizens in San Francisco was mathematically, demonstrably, a greater good for a greater number of people than preserving a scenic valley for a handful of elite, wealthy nature lovers to hike through.
The ultimate high-stakes battle of wise use versus preservation. The ledger versus the temple.
And we know who won.
In 1913, after years of bitter fighting, Congress sided with San Francisco, the engineers, and Gifford Pinchot. They authorized the O'Shaughnessy Dam.
The majestic valley was clear-cut, the concrete was poured, the valley was flooded, and it remains deep underwater to this very day, providing water to the Bay Area.
And John Muir died a year later.
Many say I have a broken heart.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Think about the terrifying implications of that decision for the rest of the continent.
Because it set a precedent.
A huge one. If the put-it-to-work ethic of the progressive era, backed by this intense mathematical metric of efficiency, was so politically powerful that it could successfully argue for flooding a spectacularly beautiful, federally protected valley inside a globally famous national park, what chance did a normal river have?
Absolutely none. The precedent was set.
Right. If Yosemite National Park wasn't safe from the ledger of progress, then an ordinary, muddy, roaring river out in the Pacific Northwest, a river with no national park status, no famous, eloquent advocates like John Muir writing poetry about it, and no romantic landscape paintings made of it, that river stood absolutely zero chance against the concrete.
None at all.
The progressive faith supplied the absolute moral and intellectual confidence that building the dam was the greatest good, and the Bureau of Reclamation and the Army Corps of Engineers were standing right there, perfectly equipped and heavily funded, ready to supply the concrete.
The doctrine of domination was complete. It was intellectually, morally, and legally bulletproof in the minds of the people executing it. The engineers genuinely believed they were building a utopia. But as we look at this seemingly flawless, highly confident progressive ledger today, a ledger where everything is neatly measured in kilowatts, acre-feet, and crop yields, we have to look very closely at the math.
Because something's missing.
Because if living rivers were being violently reduced to standardized units for the greatest good, we have to ask the most important question of all: what got left out of the equation?
When you look at the historical data, what was missing from the ledger?
There were two glaring, catastrophic, world-altering absences in the doctrine of domination. Two massive living realities that the dam builders simply did not have the conceptual framework to compute.
Okay, what was the first one?
The first missing column on the ledger was the salmon.
The salmon, the absolute biological lifeblood of the Pacific Northwest.
When the progressive engineers measured a river like the Columbia or the Snake, they measured its flow rate, its drop in elevation, the width of the canyon walls, the tensile strength of the bedrock. They meticulously quantified the water and the potential hydroelectric power.
But not the fish?
No, the fish. The millions upon millions of wild salmon that had run those rivers for 10,000 years, migrating out to the deep ocean and battling their way back up roaring rapids to the exact tiny gravel beds where they were born. The fish simply did not register as a variable on the spreadsheets.
And we need to explain the mechanics of what the salmon actually do, because they aren't just fish swimming in water. They are the engine of an entire ecosystem.
They are a keystone species.
When salmon go out to the ocean, they spend years absorbing immense amounts of marine nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, carbon, and then they swim hundreds of miles inland up into the mountains to spawn and die.
And what happens when they die?
When they die, their bodies decompose, or they are eaten by bears, eagles, and wolves, who then drag those marine nutrients deep into the woods. The salmon are literally a biological pump that fertilizes the giant ancient forests of the Pacific Northwest.
The trees are made of ocean.
Exactly. The entire immense, complex, living ecological system was tied to the salmon, and none of it, not the bears, not the trees, not the fish, appeared on the engineer's ledger.
And building on that, the most devastating part of this history is how that exclusion happened. It wasn't that the engineers brought the salmon into the boardroom, weighed their economic value against the value of hydroelectricity, and maliciously, consciously decided to kill the fish.
That is such a vital distinction.
The tragedy of it is much deeper than malice. The salmon were not weighed and rejected. They were simply never counted in the first place.
You just didn't see them.
The complex ecological system did not exist in the progressive framework of resource management. If a resource couldn't be measured as a standardized, extractable unit of human utility, like a board foot of timber or a kilowatt of power, it was functionally invisible.
Wow, invisible.
It is a quieter and in some ways a much more terrifying fact than intentional malice. They didn't hate the salmon. They literally couldn't see them as relevant to the math of progress.
And that profound blindness extended to the human realm as well, in a way that had devastating legal and moral consequences that we are still fighting over today. Because the second glaring absence in the ledger was the treaties.
The native treaties.
Many of these massive dams in the Pacific Northwest, monuments to modern engineering, were being built directly across rivers that flowed through ancestral territories where the United States government had negotiated binding sovereign treaties with native nations.
You need to look at the exact language there.
Right. In the 1850s, a man named Isaac Stevens, the governor of the Washington Territory, negotiated a series of treaties with tribes across the region. And in exchange for ceding vast tracts of land to the United States, those treaties guaranteed the native nations a very specific, fiercely negotiated, legally binding right.
What did the text say?
The language in the treaties stated they had the right to take fish at all usual and accustomed grounds and stations in common with all citizens of the territory.
In common with. Let's look at the mechanics of that promise. It is the absolute unyielding core of the legal promise.
Okay, unpack that.
The United States legally guaranteed, on paper, that native peoples would always have the right to fish at their traditional spots alongside the new settlers. It wasn't a right granted to them, it was a right they retained when they gave up the land.
But there's a practical prerequisite to that, right? Isn't there?
Exactly. That legal right implicitly necessarily presupposes that there will actually be fish to catch and that there will actually be a living, flowing river for those fish to migrate up.
You cannot exercise a legal right to fish if the federal government has just built a 300-foot wall of solid concrete that blocks the migration route, warms the water, and drives the salmon to the brink of extinction. The right becomes a ghost.
Exactly the problem. But when the engineers and the politicians were tallying up the greatest good for the greatest number, the treaty obligations owed to a minority population, obligations written into the supreme law of the land, were entirely ignored.
Just left out of the math.
The progressive doctrine of domination, with its intense focus on maximizing agricultural and industrial output, had no column for ancient legal promises or the survival of native cultures that depended on the salmon.
How does that happen? I mean, really, how does an entire culture armed with university degrees and the best science of the day become so intensely hyper-focused on one single definition of success, measuring every drop of water for kilowatts and crop yields, that it becomes entirely functionally blind to another reality?
It's a failure of imagination.
They couldn't see a massive, thriving, ancient biological ecosystem, and they couldn't see the binding legal promises written in their own laws.
It happens when an ideological paradigm becomes total, when a belief system is so dominant that it becomes the water a society swims in.
And we have to remember our rule from the beginning, right?
We must remember our rule for the beginning of this deep dive. We are naming no villains today.
Right.
The mindset that produced the dams, that birthed the massive bureaucracy of the Bureau of Reclamation, and championed the progressive gospel of efficiency, was not inherently malicious in its own understanding. It was devastatingly, tragically narrow.
They thought they were doing the right thing.
The people building these dams believed, with absolute sincerity, that they were acting in the highest moral and economic interest of the nation. They were providing electricity to light homes and water to grow food for a growing country.
They saw the water and the power perfectly.
They saw water and power with perfect, crystalline clarity. They just lacked the conceptual framework, the cultural peripheral vision to see the fish or to see the native peoples whose lives, economies, and religions depended on them.
It is the ultimate danger of absolute certainty. When you are absolutely certain that you are building a better world, when the math tells you that you are achieving the greatest good, you completely stop checking your blind spots.
That is the foundation we have laid today. We set out to reconstruct a worldview, to step inside a mindset that most of us no longer hold, and we have seen how a moral imperative to tame the desert, fueled by the desperate survival instincts of pioneers, backed by the supreme, unquestioning confidence of progressive science, and funded by the immense wealth of the federal government, created a century of concrete.
We've seen how the religious fervor of Manifest Destiny met the brutal physical reality of the 100th meridian.
We watched the magical thinking of rain follows the plow collapse into the dust of ruined farms,
only to be replaced by the sheer, unyielding mechanical willpower of the Bureau of Reclamation and the Army Corps of Engineers.
We heard the solitary, deeply rational, and entirely ignored voice of John Wesley Powell, trying to warn a speeding, optimistic nation about the hard mathematical limits of water.
And we saw how the relentless pursuit of the greatest good flooded the sacred valley of Hetch Hetchy and erased the salmon and the sovereign treaties from the map of American progress.
The massive dams of the American West aren't just engineering marvels. They are fossilized belief systems.
They are towering concrete monuments to a very specific, very narrow way of defining what is valuable in this world and what is expendable.
And that brings us to the lingering question, the thought we want to leave you with today.
Yeah.
It is very easy for us, sitting here with the benefit of a century of hindsight and modern ecological science, to look back at the politicians and engineers of 1902 and easily identify their glaring blind spots.
So easy.
We could point to the disappearing salmon and the violated treaties and say, how could they not see that? How could they be so arrogant?
It's almost a comforting distance, isn't it? We like to think we are wiser now, that our science is better, that our morals are broader. But if we accept the premise of this deep dive, that massive infrastructure is just the frozen ideology of the people who build it, then we have to turn the mirror on ourselves. What are we building today?
That is the question.
Right now, all across the globe, we are engaged in massive, unprecedented infrastructure projects in the name of green progress, in the name of artificial intelligence, in the name of our own era's definition of the greatest good.
We are building massive server farms that consume oceans of water to cool them.
We are digging continent-spanning rare earth mines for batteries.
We are testing geoengineering prototypes to alter the atmosphere.
We are pouring our own modern concrete.
Which means, just like the progressive engineers of 1902, we are inevitably, undeniably embedding our own current ideologies and our own current blind spots into the earth.
So the question for you to mull over long after this finishes is this: what will our infrastructure expose about us a century from now? When the historians of the next century look back at the massive projects we are building today with absolute certainty, what massive, glaring, catastrophic blind spots will they see that we are currently entirely blind to?
What living ecosystems or what human rights are completely missing from our modern ledgers?
It is a profoundly humbling thought, and one we desperately need to keep asking.
It really is.
We want to warmly thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the doctrine of domination. Thank you for stepping back in time with us, for practicing intellectual empathy, and for trying to understand the complex, deeply human roots of the world we've built.
Keep looking closely at the massive structures around you.
Keep asking what beliefs they are built on, and keep questioning the world. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.